Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing Understanding the Bible. I'm Pat Zerke, director of the Forum. For 37 years, Cambridge Forum has been bringing you the issues and ideas that are shaping our world. We live in a secular age, but it is also an age in which the President of the United States claims Jesus Christ as his favorite philosopher. When a best-selling series of books interprets modern political events in terms of the apocalypse. When the state of Georgia, among others, officially removes all references to evolution from its mandated science curriculum. Does the Bible say and mean only what fundamentalists claim it says and means? How can those of a liberal or progressive outlook reclaim the Bible from literalist interpretations? With us is John Buehrens, former president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, and now minister of the First Parish in Needham, Massachusetts. John is also senior advisor to the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, a member of the National Steering Committee for the Freedom to Marry, and a member of the Steering Committee of the Clergy Leadership Network for National Leadership Change. He is co-author with Forrest Church of A Chosen Faith, and his current book from Beacon Press, Understanding the Bible, an introduction for skeptics, seekers, and religious liberals, forms the basis for our discussion. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, John Buehrens.
Well, there's nothing a preacher likes better than a full church, so thank you for coming out this evening. The first chapter of my book is entitled, Why Bother with the Bible? I think the short answer to that is that if you don't bother with it, someone will bother you with it. It's something significant for me to be speaking here in Harvard Square. This is the church where I first entered liberal religion on the night when Martin Luther King was killed. When in the meeting house here, I found hanging on the wall that profound quotation from Micah, "What doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justice, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly." Earlier in that profound year of 1967-68, when I was a senior at Harvard College, I'd heard Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, of blessed memory, speak here in the Boston area against the war in Vietnam, and say to us that what we were lacking in our culture even then was the ability to keep before us the truly profound questions that the prophets of old had always tried to pose. He said we would become deaf to them because we substitute our own questions like, what do I require? In a tradition, or a community, or a cause that I would be willing to give the time of day to, much less my life, my sacred honor, my ultimate concern. He said that we, in a consumerist and individualist society, had inverted the questions that are most profound, and that there was no help for us unless we reverted to the profound questions of ultimate loyalty and justice that were at the core of our very civilization. He warned us who were acting and speaking against the war even then that there would be those of us who would go to prison, and there would be leaders who would die. This was months before Dr. King's death. And told us that when the prophetic voices of any time are silenced, there is no help to be found in the lives of individuals in their isolation. Though one, he said, quoting Martin Buber, may pray that the spark of faith may be rekindled in their soul in their hour of need. The only ultimate help, he said, is to be found in the lives of communities that gather in the spirit of the prophets, asking their profound and challenging questions, often without pretending to know all the answers, but only how important it is to keep the questions alive. So that's why it's meaningful to me to be back here at the First Parish in Cambridge with this book. How often as an undergraduate I found myself as a young major in history and literature of the Renaissance and Reformation, being turned to by my classmates who were otherwise well educated to explain some religious reference in a work of art or music or literature. And so perhaps the roots of this book go all the way back there. But more particularly, they come from the present context of our lives. For we are indeed bothered by people who claim the letter of the Bible but do not understand its spirit. Just today I was visiting a website started by a progressive Lutheran clergyman in South Carolina who was inspired by a remark made by the Reverend Al Sharpton during the recent primary campaigns down there. Sharpton evidently said, "The Christian right is not listening to the right Christians." And so I encourage you to visit therightchristians.org. I myself have helped to form a network all across this country of progressive and moderate clergy who are profoundly disturbed about the direction of a narcissistic and arrogant foreign policy, an economic policy that shows a preferential option for the rich, and a neglect of stewardship for the creation that we were given to tend and keep. It's important times for every single human being and citizen in this culture and society to go to the roots and to claim the radical right, which a wonderful old meeting house like this really proclaims in the public square. The right and the obligation of every human being to see the scriptural heritages of our society as human literature about ultimate and divine things. Not divine literature ordering human beings about, but literature that was formed out of the prophetic intuitions of our forebears, men and women alike, who discerned in the workings of history and in the mystery and abundance of the creation a kind of claim on their conscience and soul that they could not ignore. I claim from my own perspective on this literature the term that was used by Martin Buber, biblical humanist. However oxymoronic that may seem in Alabama, where they wish to perpetrate the idolatry of putting the Ten Commandments on a rock in the Supreme Court, I say that my understanding of this literature, for which I am profoundly grateful, stems from my commitment to read it as a product of human experience that, if read correctly, has to do with our ability to shape human history toward the ends of human justice and human dignity. Recognizing that we are all called upon to walk humbly before a common source. We cannot control. We cannot shape. Who's beyond image and beyond the idolatries that are so common in the name of the God of the Bible. Biblical humanism, said Buber, is the only way that we can stand and face down the idolatries of our time. When the SS came to his study in Frankfurt in the 1930s and asked him to surrender all of the subversive literature he had, he who was at work translating the Hebrew Bible into German, because he knew that Luther's translation had been the source of idolatrous, nationalistic, anti-Semitic tendencies that were about to burst forth. Buber simply lifted up the text of the Hebrew prophets and said, "Here, take this." There is not a more subversive work of literature ever penned by human beings that is more aimed at facing down the idolatries of blood and soil that your chauvinism stands for. I wrote this book in part to re-empower ordinary people to claim their right that goes right back to the prophetic tradition, right back to the radical, voluntaristic tradition of the Reformation, out of which an old meeting house like this really arises. Not only to do it in political terms and for cultural literacy, but frankly, I also wrote this book because 30 years of experience as a pastor in liberal religious circles has convinced me that there are entirely too many people who have left their exposure to the biblical literature at the level of their most traumatic junior high experience. And that ain't good for us. There's a challenge built into this to reclaim the right to encounter the authors, the sources, the stories afresh, human to human, not junior high student to authority figure. Buber had a wonderful metaphor about the problems that every human being encounters in trying to have a real face-to-face, transforming, meaningful encounter with another human being that opens up the possibility of seeing in the I and the thou some resonance of the eternal thou that wants us to treat one another as sisters and brothers, wants us to claim our responsibility for shaping the history before us, the gift of freedom that's been given us. On the one hand, he said there's this problem that opens up every time we try for that encounter, where we stand on our defense and pretend to have all the answers already, because we're objective. The abyss that opens up in the potential human meeting when we pretend to have all the answers already and to be objective. It's a long slide down. So is the one that opens up to the other side when we are so tied up in our own subjectivity and our own experiences and our own wounds that we can't really meet the other or the literature in its full humanness. I try with my mentor, Martin Buber, to walk the narrow ridge, this side of any pretense to objectivity, and just past, wallowing in my own subjective reactions. You see, there are two questions that people often bring to the biblical literature that block their full encounter with it. One is on the objective side, the historical side, and the other on the literary side, the more subjective side. And neither is a particularly profound question, but they are very common and they get in the way. One is the historical question, did it really happen? I think of my friend who talks about a Sunday school teacher who was teaching her back in the 1950s about Jesus walking on the water, and then suddenly got self-conscious, since it was a Unitarian church, and assured the students in the 5th grade that there must have been sandbars. This friend of mine suggests that there are always 3 levels to the language and the stories of a tradition as rich and deep as the biblical literature. There's the surface, literal, mythic level. There's the historical, scientific, critical level. But perhaps the one that we need to probe for, often beneath the surface of the waves, is the spiritual existential meaning. That's the place where we meet the human reality that was clearly meant to be conveyed by a story of people who had followed a leader whose death had still left them with the sense that they had met in that person someone who had managed to move through the very storms of life with an inner confidence and calm that had about it the quality of the eternal and the miraculous. Well, the other side of the question is the literary one. It comes up time and time again, too. And as I say, is not always the most profound question, but we got to get it out of the way to begin. Do I like the lead character in the story? As though the Bible were a novel. My friend Jack Miles, former Jesuit, graduate of Harvard Divinity School, wrote a wonderful book. And I try to reference a lot of popular contemporary literature about the Bible in my introduction, saying simply, the book is called God, a Biography. And it's about the God of the Hebrew Bible. Jack observes that if you look at the development of the lead character through the course of the Hebrew Bible, there's good news. God gets better. Somehow, in the interaction with human beings in the story, God goes from being as arbitrary and cruel and peremptory as we human beings are capable of being, to somehow being more patient and more inclusive. Alan Dershowitz here at Harvard Law School has suggested in another book that I reference, The Genesis of Justice, that even the 10 Commandments, known among Unitarians, of course, as the 10 Suggestions, emerge from some of those stories of the primeval era, Cain and Abel, Noah, his children, where the stories are told in order to illustrate some basic moral principles. Don't murder. Don't despise your parents lest you be left lonely in your age. Things we human beings learn and codify by experience, and then attribute to that voice that resonates through our common experience, like the voice that the Hebrews heard out there in the desert after they had escaped from their slavery, saying to them, "Be grateful for this freedom you have. Don't go back, but look back. And don't ever treat anyone the way you were treated back there. Don't make idols out of some portion of the creation, like the gods of Egypt. Don't obsess about your immortality and build pyramids to dead rulers. Pay attention to your common life in the time that's yours. Be a people on the move toward justice. Be an Exodus people." That's the spirit of the prophets that resonates all the way through to the prophet of Nazareth. And perhaps the hardest sell I have in this book, I would say it resonates even through Paul of Tarsus and the early Christian community. That in a time of decaying empire, tried to build little communities of real moral depth and concern and compassion against the consumerism and the vulgarity of their times, and to claim an equality before God that transformed the sensibilities of an entire generation, an entire empire. Well, obviously, I get rather worked up about what has been done to turn the Bible into an idolatrous symbol of security rather than a guide to deeper wisdom and more just community. It's a pretentious thing to write a little book trying to introduce people in a secular age to the whole of the biblical literature in 200 pages. Last spring, I sat next to my first teacher in New Testament studies, the former dean of Harvard Divinity School, Krister Stendahl, one of the great pioneers in teaching Christians how frequently they had bought into an anti-Judaism and an anti-Semitism by their misreadings of their own texts. Someone to whom I'm profoundly grateful. And I said, "Bishop Stendahl, you know, he used to be the bishop of the Swedish Lutheran Bishop of Stockholm. I have a confession to make to you as my father in God in New Testament studies. I have sinned against all the canons of Harvard University and its scholarship. I have written a book on the Bible that is aimed at a popular audience." And Stendahl replied, "Ah? And what people do you think you have written this book for?" And I replied, "Well, I've written it for skeptics, seekers, and religious liberals." To which he said, "Ah, well, you Unitarian Universalists, you know such people." And then he asked, "And what part of the Bible are you trying to introduce them to?" And I said, "Well, my publisher gave me 200 pages to introduce them to the whole thing. It's called Understanding the Bible, an introduction for skeptics, seekers, and religious liberals." There was a long pause. "Ah," said the bishop, So now we will understand, will we? I want to assure you this evening that I do not pretend to offer here a final interpretation. And as I dialogue with you about your understandings and non-understandings about aspects of the biblical literature, I want to make that clear. My aim through our dialogue this evening and through my book is really to help you wrestle with the deep and profound questions of how we encounter this literature in ways that will more fully empower us as children of one great mystery to help shape the history that's yet before us in ways that are God intended for justice and equality. There are problems in the Bible. God knows. It came from human hands. It came from a patriarchal age. It came through male scribes who minimized the voice and experience of women. It comes down to most of us in this culture through a heritage of church authority that allowed the emperor to determine what the canon of the scripture would be and who would be authorized to do the interpretation. But it is up to us to reclaim its original inspiration. The profound questions of the prophets, the dream of Jesus and his commonwealth of equals, the spiritual heritage that at its core would have died long ago, did it not have within it the redemptive, inspirational qualities that have guided so many, even in dark times like our own. Let me finish by just suggesting that there are a few strategies to be borne in mind. One comes from our Jewish instructors in biblical matters, and another from feminist teachers. In Rabbinic Judaism, you know, there is a wonderful tradition known as Midrash, which might be simplified as, in its agadic form at least, telling a story that helps to humanize and break open and make relevant the story that otherwise doesn't make sense. Oh, and it comes in its feminist forms in our day, too. If you haven't read Anita Diamond's wonderful book, The Red Tent, a redemptive novel-length midrash on the experience of women in the patriarchal era of the biblical tradition, well, you've missed a real treat. But midrash, well, some of my favorites I tell with reference to the central story of the Hebrew tradition, the Exodus. One rabbi said, when they got to the Red Sea and Moses lifted his arm, and the text has a little rupture there, nothing happened. Why was that? Why didn't God act immediately? Well, said the rabbi, maybe it was because at least one of the Hebrews had to actually get in the water before God would part them. No, said another, it was that the whole people had to get in the water and swim as far as they could. And then would God show mercy and compassion and let them walk through. And another one suggested that the first one who entered the waters was Miriam, around whose song of celebration of the Exodus the entire tradition actually seems to coalesce. Stories that help to break open and interpret the stories are a valid way of interpreting the whole heritage. The alternative being to just stick at a level that is entirely too dehumanized to be credible, because this is human literature. Secondly, I learned from my teacher, Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza, again at Harvard Divinity School, how important it is that sometimes we learn to read even the most oppressive texts against the grain, against the very grain of what seems to most bother us. Take the story of Abraham and his son Isaac, or in the Muslim version, Abraham and Ishmael, the Qurban, for which the feast at the end of the Hajj was just observed. We tremble at the implication that parents are asked to sacrifice their children. Consider the possibility that these stories are in the tradition in order to say to us profoundly from an early era in which all too often that took place, that is precisely what God does not want. Or take a story from the last part of the scriptures, from some of the most problematic texts of the Christian scriptures, the New Testament, where women and slaves are being told, be obedient, stay quiet, as in the letters of Peter, written by the leadership of the Christian community at Rome. As Dr. Schussler-Fiorenza taught me, isn't it interesting that under conditions of persecution, the leaders of the community had to write to the distant Christian gatherings in Asia and say to them, now, don't act too different from the society around you in this time of persecution. Just because within our community we know that in Christ there is neither slave nor free, Gentile nor Greek, male nor female, because we're all equal. Don't let the rest of the world come after you for that revolutionary spirit that's in your midst. We need to recapture some of that spirit in new and fresh readings, even if it means reading against the grain of Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell and every hierarchical interpretation that would challenge the prophets and challenge the commonwealth of equals. We need to reclaim our right to the prophetic spirit so that we might indeed serve justice and promote mercy and compassion, and ask everyone to look a little bit more humbly at the humanness in this human heritage that is the core of our culture. Thanks for your attention.
You're joining us at Cambridge Forum listening to John Buehrens discussing Understanding the Bible. John, I'd like to open the questions by talking a little bit more about your book. You already alluded to the difficulty of having only 200 pages to cope with the entire Bible as well as centuries of interpretation and tradition. But you did it, and the model that you rely on is primarily historical and chronological as you open the door to the Bible, to the skeptic, seeker, and religious liberal. In some ways, this method seemed to me to really be holding readers at a distance, and it was very different from the more personal, more and focused interpretations of someone like Rabbi Harold Kushner in his very popular book, Why Bad Things Happen to Good People, which I grant you doesn't deal with the whole Bible, just part of it.
And which I draw on, particularly during my chapter called Frustrations, which deals with the wisdom literature and the Job story.
Right. But why did you choose the historical, chronological, interpretive framework for this book? What do you see as its limitations? And what would you recommend after the skeptics read your book as a next step?
Well, actually, I don't think I chose that framework. I've tried very hard to stay on the narrow ridge between the historical and the literary. But you're quite right, Pat, in perceiving that an awful lot of literature about the Bible falls on one side or the other. It becomes either terribly concerned with the historical questions, did it really happen, or the questions of our literary response. I think that what I was trying to do was actually strike a balance between the two. It's a difficult thing to do with readers, obviously. I wanted to do two things that are not common, and one was to deal with the Hebrew Bible on its own terms, and not simply as a prelude to the Christian scriptures. So in that sense, I do deal a good deal with historical development, because you get too many people who dismiss or subordinate the real integrity of the Hebrew Scripture, and making it just a prelude to the Christian Scriptures. Even some of the historical writers, like those associated with the Jesus Seminar, tend to be so concerned with the historical questions about the good Rabbi of Nazareth that they're not focused on what I learned from feminist authors. Really needs to be a primary concern, our response. So I, all the way through, also make literary references that try, and other cultural references to things like, well, we're about to be subjected to Mel Gibson's Passion movie. An evocation of how dangerous it can be to try to retell the last days of Christ as though all four gospel accounts deserved equal weight or could be easily conflated the way we conflate the birth stories of Matthew and Luke at Christmas time. I was tremendously moved, and I start my chapter about the Passion with Osvaldo Golohov's magnificent oratorio on the Passion story. This is he's a composer at the New England Conservatory, born in Buenos Aires. His mother was a Romanian Jew and his father a Russian atheist. And he writes a Passion a la J.S. Bach that he wanted to be as emotionally resonant for a cultured despiser of religion in a concert hall in Cambridge or in Stockholm as for a peasant woman in Latin America. And so I want to get that existential level as well. To the extent that you thought I was being primarily historical and chronological, you got the textbook side and not the more personal side.
Well, I'll amend that. Your organizational principle in the book was historical. You do touch on the literary side.
Well, the other thing I try to do is to do the whole of the Bible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what would you recommend then as a next step once the door has been opened and these contexts have been understood and the big story arc is understood?
Right.
Where does somebody go from there?
Sure. Well, there's a Beacon Press that published the book is about to put up on its website a study guide for the book. The book was very much designed for group study. It's organized so that you can read it in 5 units of 4 chapters. The 4 introductory chapters: reasons, why bother, traditions, where does the Bible come from, versions, which Bible should I read, interpretations, what are the basic strategies of progressive biblical interpretation. 4 chapters on the first half of the Hebrew Bible, 4 chapters on the second half of the Hebrew Bible, 4 chapters on the Gospels, and a summary session on the latter Christian literature. Or it can be done with texts drawn from each chapter in a more extended fashion. Being an old hand at adult religious education programs in progressive churches and other community settings, it was also designed so that the Hebrew Bible part can be taught in the autumn, culminating with the chapter called Expectations, which deals with the Hanukkah story and with the developments in Judaism under Greek and then later Roman oppression that led to a variety of messianic expectations. And then after Christmas, in the winter or early spring, there's 6 chapters on Christian scriptures. And I encourage the leaders doing small group study using this book to use the book to get the barriers out of the way so that participants can have a fresh encounter with some particular texts. And then perhaps to adapt from Walter Wink, a wonderful biblical scholar of our time, the technique of asking people when reading a particular text to actually get into it, literally take apart, feel what it's like to be the Levite passing by on the road, or the person who's been robbed and cast into a ditch, or the Samaritan who pays at the inn. Those are techniques that I hope people will use when reading the book.
Okay. Thank you. Now I'd like to follow up very quickly before opening the floor to the audience's questions. You mentioned Mel Gibson's Passion of Christ, and recently the head of the religion department at Boston University published a book on how Christ became a celebrity, and almost to follow up, how did Jesus become the Son of God? Now, how did the Son of God become a celebrity in 21st century American culture? Where does this popular culture's interest in the Bible, in the apocalypse, in the figure of Jesus, what does it say about our popular culture? What does it say about us?
Well, there's always a great deal of danger of projection, the subjectivity that I was warning about in interpretations of biblical literature. The book that you're alluding to, which I think is called more like The American Jesus, speaks about how in America we've gone through phases of trying to interpret the Jesus of the Scriptures as well, a good middle-class liberal, or an athlete and a businessman, or a social gospel pioneer, or a healer. There are dimensions of all of this in the complex text. But the tendency to do our interpretations only out of our own subjective desires and to see reflected down at the bottom of the well our own faces is a very profound one in biblical literature, which is one reason why I think it's important for what I try to do here is in no small part give people enough of the historical and the objective so that they don't feel that they can go down just any road they wish and do authentic justice to a real encounter with the fullness of these texts. After all, there is a real history to where the text came from and what some of the intents were. And I think they're so radically challenging at their core that we need to watch out for that subjectivity.
You're listening to John Buehrens discussing understanding the Bible. The floor is now open for your questions, and I would ask you to use the microphone in the central aisle.
And I'm particularly interested in helping to work particular stories or texts or ideas, the themes of the biblical tradition that you've always found to be a complete pain. So have at me. Oh, shy people. Yes. Can you come to the mic?
Come to the microphone.
One is a text, and it's Esau and Jacob.
Oh, yes.
Do I have the right people?
Mm-hmm.
And the other is just a general question. I get confused on which Bible. In other words, King James or Jerusalem or what?
Yeah.
And
Let me start with the latter, because one of the things I try to do very carefully in the chapter called Versions is to help people understand that the traditions that formed the scriptural literature include profound differences in the texts. For example, I'm very careful to talk about the Hebrew Bible in a way that does not conflate it with the New Testament. Or with the Old Testament, I'm sorry. Just this afternoon, I was grading a student's paper who was making a comparison of some themes in the book of Ruth and some themes in the book of Judges. Very insightful. But she managed to point out that in her text, Ruth comes right after Judges. It's the way it falls in the Christian version, the Old Testament, but that's not where it is in the original Hebrew Bible. Where the structure of the Hebrew Bible is one of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and then the prophets, and then the writings, including a scripture like Ruth or Esther or Ecclesiastes. Well, so there's some real guidance about if I'm going to get a Bible and try to do a little biblical study, which one should I pick up? And I provide both suggestions if you want to do it within a Jewish tradition, if you want to do it out of the more culturally dominant Protestant tradition, or if you want to do it within a Catholic tradition, which study Bibles might be most appropriate for you. Jacob and Esau, a great story of substitution. One of the most profound themes in the Genesis stories is that of someone, often the younger child, being substituted for the older one. Esau is the firstborn twin. And Jacob, who evidently emerges in the story from his mother's womb holding his brother's heel, is the ancestor of the people Israel. The person who goes on to, through wrestling through the night with an angel, get his name transformed into Israel, the one who wrestles or struggles with God. But Jacob is no paragon of virtue. You know, we Americans talk about George Washington as though he never told a lie and warned us against entangling events overseas and was a pillar of rectitude. One of the things that is so interesting and characteristic about the Hebrew Bibles is their capacity to tell their own story from a God's eye point of view very critically. It's a part of the whole biblical tradition that, again, I think Americans have a heck of a time relating to. Because we'd rather pat ourselves on the back and see in a scripture people who were little paragons of virtue, little models of behavior. This is to some degree shaped later by the way in which Christians relate to the story of Jesus, in part as a model of human behavior. But the Hebrews told the story of their leaders, warts and all. Jacob's a liar and a thief who steals his brother's birthright. I remember when I was in my congregation in New York some years ago, I was teaching about the biblical tradition with a group of adults when the 5th grade class that my daughter was in came marching through the back of the hall. They were doing that week the story of the Exodus, and they were carrying signs that said things like, "Impeach Moses," "Meat, not manna," "Back to Egypt." And I learned from their teacher that later that day they had put Moses on trial for getting them out into the middle of a desert with no security. Very good teaching in that church, I'll tell you. And the sad thing to report, of course, is that they did impeach Moses. Decided that going back to Egypt would be better and safer. The previous week, they had put Jacob on trial for stealing his brother's birthright. And guess who they found guilty? His mother. Because if you read the story, it's Rachel who pushes her favorite son forward and has him disguise himself as his hairier brother and get the father's birthright so that she can be taken care of. Well, one of my favorite stories.
The Gospels, in part, were written as anti-Jewish polemic, or the tension between two strains of Judaism at the time. I went to hear, before one of the local groups sang the Passion according to St. John, there was a seminar and talking about what to do with these texts. They're so vitriolic, they're so laden with Jew hatred. What do you do about that?
Well, one of the things I do is try to separate the layers of even the gospel tradition. So I start with a chapter about what's the very character of a gospel. It's a proclamation. I start with the Gospel of Mark, which is probably the shortest, earliest, and least tainted with any forms of anti-Judaism. It, in fact, emerges about the time that the temple is being destroyed. Comes out of that great trauma of Jewish history that is the second destruction of a place of worship for the people of Israel. The proclamation, of course, is something like this. Even in the midst of this destruction, we need not lose faith. There is someone who has emerged who has actually acted the way we're all supposed to act. Has acted as though anointed to build the real community of equals that goes all the way back to the Exodus tradition. And so maybe it doesn't matter that we don't have a national temple anymore. Maybe there's hope that we can all act in that way, that the anointment falls upon us all. Now, mind you, that is an interpretation of Mark, but it's not far from what many early Christians understood to be the basic message, and what attracted many non-Jews to those early Jews around the synagogues of the Eastern Mediterranean. where there were people who were saying, even though our little people is being destroyed out in that corner of the empire, there's still a spirit in our midst where we worship the one unseen creative power of history, and where we are brought to a moral integrity that we know you admire, and so you're welcome to join us. Now, the Passion stories become problematic, particularly in the Gospel of John, about which there are two theories. One is the dominant one, that it comes out of the painful period after the early people who proclaimed Jesus as the Anointed One had been expelled from the synagogues, where they essentially said, "Are you kidding? God's done a good thing? Look at the mess." That parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity is a very difficult process on which, sure, it's easy from the dominance in Christian history to say it's the heritage of anti-Judaism that's primary. But what you're reading is, in part, an expression of people who felt that they themselves were misunderstood. And the other theory, by the way, about John is that it comes from a Samaritan Christian, from those people who were outside the main body of the people of Israel from the earliest times, and who therefore often talked about the Jews. So it's a complex story, one that I try to lay out and let people investigate further.
I don't know whether your book deals with this, but something that I've always wondered about is, how did the book that we call the Bible get put together in the first place? Who did it? What was the process? Were there other essays or stories of equal merit that didn't make it? Why not? We call it the Holy Bible. Was it instantly holy, or did that take a while to develop? Those kinds of things.
Sure. Yes, indeed, I do deal with this, particularly in the chapter early on called Traditions, which is about tradition formation in the Scriptures and about the great traumas of history that caused people to take the inherited stories and the wisdom and to put them together in texts that wouldn't be lost. The Hebrew Bible basically coalesces originally around the first trauma of the people of Israel, which is the Great Exile in Babylon. And it is after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in the 6th century before the Common Era, in the exile, that the priests and the literate people who were all hauled away. This was the way the Babylonians did empire. Decapitation. Cut the head off. Take all of the literate people away and hold them in bondage. How can they sing a song of Jerusalem in a foreign land? But of course they had to. They had to not only remember the stories and begin to codify them, they had to prepare for what became possible in history, the return to a second Jewish commonwealth where Ezra reads out in the Temple Square in Jerusalem the Torah as basically the constitution for a revived Jewish state. The next trauma, it comes at the time of the destruction of the temple the second time, which is heavily tied up both with the founding of Christianity as a movement within Judaism and the development of what becomes Rabbinic Judaism. It's without temple worship that both traditions come into being in history. And the last thing that I would cite really would be what us religious progressives have always regarded as a great catastrophe, the subjection of the church to the state, with the Nicene captivity of the church under Constantine. And that is the point at which the canon of the Christian scriptures becomes really finally fixed and closed, although it had been solidifying over a period of centuries, and where the alternative gospels, some of which are associated with the Gnostic tradition, and where the wisdom literature in early Christianity that was often much better at capturing the experience of women actually gets marginalized and excluded from the canon. So basically there are three moments of canon formation, although the process is a rather complicated one, and I try to do justice to it in a little bit greater detail in the book.
Thank you.
Hey, John. Nice to see you again. I'm starting from an interesting position, I suppose, and perhaps a lot of us here are. I'm certainly much more bordering on atheist than agnostic, I suppose, and I'm also constantly reminded of the game where people are sitting in a circle, or the game of phone, and you tell a story. By the time you get to the end, I don't recognize it,
right,
type of thing. So if you could give me the crib sheet version of where does someone like, I mean, I know the book is for people like myself, and I will certainly read the book, but I haven't yet, John. So if I can get the crib sheet version of what do I do? How do I look at this as far as, lose my skepticism, my cynicism, so I can just stop thinking it's a bunch of mishmash, even though I understand some of the stuff is real and so forth and so on, paraphrasing, so I can talk to people who are really hardcore believers and just don't simply dismiss them.
Right. I think that's exactly what I'm trying to do, and the trick is to get to the level where you can really relate to this as stories that had deep human meaning and potentially can still have deep human meaning. They're often less about God as a being among beings than atheists think. Because, in fact, the biblical tradition, as Paul Tillich pointed out, suggests that would be an idol, a God who's just a being among beings. The God of the Bible is, in fact, as he put it, the ground of being, the source of creation, the source of the very fact that there's something rather than nothing, the source of the wonder of this evolving, creating universe that we're involved in, and not the possession of a particular people. Although perceived in history intermittently, particularly by those who suffer oppression, and who in their very oppression get in touch again with the fact that there is such a thing as a gift of freedom. I think of Viktor Frankl, the existentialist psychologist, who said that he didn't realize the core spiritual freedom that was available to him, or how responsible he was for how he should use it, until his freedom was most constricted when he was in a Nazi concentration camp. Up until that point, God had been out there, and largely the possession of somebody who was trying to do something to him. Only in the middle of that non-freedom did he recognize that there was a gift of freedom right at the core of his very being, that he was responsible for using to the best of his ability every minute, every hour, every day, in how he related to his fellow prisoners, in how he kept hope, in how he thought about the possibility of overturning oppression. And I think there's an awful lot of that I'm trying to get people to grasp at a very human level, right at the core of this tradition.
Let's see. I'm not sure if I have a question so much as a comment. I was thinking, during your speech about my own experience, and that is that I grew up going to a conservative church and was very turned off by Christianity and the Bible, and at first didn't think that there was anything in it for me, and it seemed like, as you said, that many people had co-opted the Bible
Yeah.
to serve their own needs, and the thing is that they kind of key in on the parts that serve their purpose, rather
You've noticed that.
Yeah, rather than looking at the whole big picture. I mean, for example, one of the big issues now is, gay marriage, and people are pointing to like certain select phrases from the Bible and saying that it's against God, it's against family, and all that kind of stuff. And they justify the reasoning by saying that, this is the Word of God saying that it's wrong, and I don't know. I guess like for those kinds of people, I've just sort of learned that it's pointless to really argue with it, but I think it's important for me to sort of reclaim the Bible as maybe there's parts of it that I don't understand. Well, as you said, I also agree that it's written by many people, and I'm not going to agree with everything that every single writer in the Bible writes.
Exactly.
If I don't look at it as if every single word comes from God, then it's not too hard to maybe not overlook those parts, but just realize that it's coming from a different point of view, a different mentality.
Yeah. Atheist.com reviewed my book, and they didn't like it. It wasn't nearly angry enough for them or dismissive enough. And I made the assumption that they found particularly annoying that there is still something to be said for reading according to the Spirit rather than the letter. They said the letter is nothing but a hodgepodge of oppressive old stories. There is no Spirit in the Bible. To which my response is, frankly, wait a minute. The very story of how these stories coalesced suggests that there are some key things around which other traditions need to be tested. For example, the core of the Hebrew Bible is a story of liberation from oppression. The fact that there was a priestly purity code that came into existence with the Second Temple that made a big deal out of intermarriage and shellfish and reproduction because there was a fear of the people disappearing if they didn't reproduce and fill the earth, may not be the primary message. In fact, the prophets didn't think it was. Neither did that rather radical community of equals that surrounded Jesus and his followers. Paul, it's so ironic to have Christians claiming that Leviticus and its prohibitions against same-sex love are in full force today, when in fact the eating of shellfish is also considered an abomination there. And Paul is quite specific on that kind of purity code not being dominant. It's the tendency to use proof texting and idolatrous readings of the part instead of the spirit of the whole is one of the things that progressives have got to learn to just speak up against.
You've already mentioned the Jesus Seminar. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about where you stand compared to them and some other modern biblical scholars, particularly Marcus Borg, who's written Reading the Bible Again for the First Time, and maybe tell us why you should buy your book and not his. And then
that's what my publisher asked me before I wrote it.
and also Luke Timothy Johnson, who's written about the misguided quest for the historical Jesus.
Marcus and I are very much on the same page in many respects. The differences are simply these. As a member of the Jesus Seminar and a liberal Christian, he addresses himself primarily to people for whom the biblical literature still has some central spiritual authority. I wanted to address a broader audience. including those who do not see themselves within a community of faith that uses the Bible in an authoritative way. Secondly, Marcus, as a liberal Christian, tends to be interested in the Hebrew Bible primarily as prelude. He doesn't mean to do that dismissively, but just inevitably the book is heavily about reading the Gospels again for the first time and what we can learn from how the Hebrew Bible leads up to that. I wanted to treat the Hebrew Bible very much on its own terms. And thirdly, I wanted to organize the book so that it would be a good adult education text. Rather than something that just individuals would read, I wanted it to be the guide to group discussion. So those are the three primary differences. They're not huge theological or philosophical differences with Marcus. The one is that the Jesus Seminar does stay kind of stuck on the did he really say that? What kind of guy was he really? Historical side of the question. I'm not sure that's all that enlightening past a certain point. There's also the what do we do with the whole of the cultural and literary heritage question. Feminist scholarship taught me how important that is. And so I also want to go back and rebalance the historical and literary sides of biblical interpretation for ordinary people.
Thank you for sharing your passions with us tonight. It's been very interesting. And as an aside, I'd say you seem to represent the Christian wing of the Christian party.
Well, I'm often reminded of Frederick Buechner, one of my favorite theologians, a novelist, Presbyterian minister, who says, I'm a part-time Christian, part-time novelist, full-time pig, just snuffling and groveling at the trough of life. And I just try to root around here looking for the truffles in the biblical literature, because I am utterly convinced that they are there and they are delicious.
Okay, well, you may have answered my actual question, which is, you mentioned a biblical humanist as a phrase earlier. Yeah. Why that and not a humanist or a Buddhist humanist? What is the attraction of the Bible?
Well, I often say that I'll have a time to be a Buddhist in my next incarnation, if that means really understanding the root metaphors that would go with that entire worldview. In this particular life, I find my own vocation, which I don't impose on anybody else, my own vocation in trying to redirect the self-understanding of this culture to a more liberating and humanizing approach to its core literature. So I find myself wrestling with this stuff all through the night in the hopes that by dawn I'll extract from it a blessing, even if I come out of it a little wounded and a little transformed.
One last question. It's not really a question. I just wanted to offer my support by using the Bible in an idolatrous way and quoting a scripture that would support everything you're doing, I hope. I was brought up as a Bible-reading Christian. I don't think my father knew about any other books. But when I had difficulty with him sometimes in discussing the wider view, I said, remember that you can tell me the exact reference. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction, that the man of God may be perfect, rightly divining the word of truth.
Rightly divining.
So thank you for your contribution to that.
Thank you. And by the way, the word that is often in the Christian scriptures translated as perfect used to drive me nuts. One of the things I do in here is point out that a better translation is mature. I aim for more mature readings of stuff that all too often we've left back at the junior high level. Don't stay there. Don't let anybody else tell you what it says. Grow up and read this stuff for yourself. Claim your own right to interpret it.
We have a couple questions there. Let's take them.
Hi. My question is, I'm going to be a little controversial.
Sure.
It's coming from a feminist standpoint, and I have a particularly difficult time with the story of the birth of Christ, particularly the role of Mary, and what that's become as an emblem of Christian womanhood. I'm wondering if you have any ideas about how us in the liberal tradition can take something away from Mary and what she stands for, particularly the fact that Catholicism uses her a lot, especially in South America and Central America, as the symbol of Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you have anything to say about that.
The birth stories about Jesus are a wonderful early example of midrash. That is, of people who were trying to tell stories to explain the story that they had received. Matthew, for example, knew almost nothing about Jesus' childhood or birth. It's pretty clear. And I'm taking this from a Roman Catholic biblical scholar, Raymond Brown. Except that he was Jesus, Bar Yosef, son of Joseph. His mother was named Miriam, and he came from Nazareth, which was a problem because the Messiah wasn't supposed to be born in Nazareth, but in Bethlehem. And so I tell the story of how Matthew really gets creative and uses an archetype based on the Joseph of the Hebrew Bible, who was a dreamer, who went down into Egypt, and how Joseph, the father of Jesus, then, and by the way, the ancestry from David is traced through Joseph, is given 4 dreams to interpret. The first of them telling him that when Mary is pregnant and he knows that he was not part of that, he's not to abandon her. This is what led the poet William Blake to make Joseph the hero of the Christmas story, the embodiment of an unconditional love. There are some tremendously problematic issues having to do with the portrayal of women generally in the scriptural tradition. But in the Lucan story, one of the most beautiful things is Mary singing what becomes known in the Catholic and liturgical tradition as the Magnificat. My soul magnifies the Lord, praises God, because he's lifted up the lowly, and he's going to cast down the powerful from their seats of power, and he's given me a great gift. It's a song that's based on the Song of Hannah in the Hebrew Bible. And when you begin to read it with the resonance that lay behind it and to see how, at its core, some of these stories of women giving birth to new possibility were redemptive stories within a patriarchal structure. You can begin to see why peasant women in Latin America would relate so vividly to the Virgin of Guadalupe, who's portrayed as being a woman of their own skin. There's a missing element in literature that comes down from the patriarchal levels. Where's the place of the divine feminine? And of course, the image of Mary helps to fill that. It fills it in a sometimes distorted way, but that doesn't mean that we need to leave it in its distortion. We can begin to see it with our own interpretive eyes and in a way that makes for greater justice and greater equality.
Your last question?
Yes, I'd like to go back to junior high.
Uh-huh.
Well, not literally. But thinking of junior high, one of my confrontations with the Bible was to look at stories revolving around community and war, things like the Battle of Jericho.
Yeah.
And at that point, I was kind of young. I was interested in things like peace, at least theoretically. And what would you say to someone like that, or, you know, to anyone, given these kinds of stories that we might look on pretty unfavorably by today's moral standards?
Sure.
Why go back to those stories?
Well, I'm not suggesting that every story has to be used as a model or as something normative, particularly in a tradition that so often, as I pointed out earlier, is trying to look at things from a critical point of view. You're not always being presented with stories of people who are behaving nicely. And even when God is being portrayed as asking for you to wipe out those other folk, as I pointed out earlier, it's in the arc of a longer story in which there's an enormous amount of divine repentance and transformation. One of the things that historians have pointed out about Jericho and the myth of the Hebrews conquering the Canaanites and moving into the land is that there's absolutely no archaeological evidence that it ever happened. It's a myth of origin that the people of Israel built up in order to tell themselves, we deserve this place where we live. It got used by our forebears who came here to New England, who treated the Native Americans as though they were the Canaanites, and they were the people of the New Israel. And that is a lasting stain on the use of that particular myth. But the interesting part is that when you do historical critical research about where this thing came from, you discover there probably was never any conquest of Canaan. Only a small portion of the people who became Israel were ever even slaves in Egypt. There was a decay of the Egyptian empire. People who were landless rose up against the vassal states and the landowners who were paying tribute to the Egyptians. And they gradually formed a confederation. And they formed themselves into a people by covenant. In Jericho? No, I have a jar in my home that comes from Jericho 4,000 years ago, but I don't believe the walls just came tumbling down. So, these and many other things remain to be investigated more deeply. I hope, if nothing else, I've intrigued you enough to realize that you don't have to read it the way people have told you to read it. And I hope that you'll use the book in a way that will help you recapture your right to interpret the Bible in a liberating and liberal way.
Thank you, John Buehrens.